Several weeks ago, Professor Chomsky presented some of the material in these lectures to an audience at Ryerson Polytechnical Institute in Toronto, after which he was questioned by a panel of Canadian journalists. This is David Frum, associate editor of Saturday Night Magazine.
You say that what the media do is to ignore certain kinds of atrocities that are committed by us and our friends, and to play up enormously atrocities that are committed by them and our enemies. And you posit, in fact you say in the Massey lectures, that there's a test of integrity and moral honesty, which is to have a kind of equality of treatment of corpses.
Equality of principles.
I mean, that every dead person should be in principle equal to every other dead person.
That's not what I say at all.
Well, I'm glad that's not what you say, because that's not what you do.
Of course it's not what I do, nor would I say it. In fact, I say the opposite. What I say is that we should be responsible for our own actions primarily. That's something quite different.
With 100 priests.
I wasn't equating them. I was comparing the treatment of them. If you want my value judgment, we should give much more attention to one priest who we've killed than to 100 priests that they've killed. Notice that this is exactly
your method.
That's exactly my method.
Because your method is to ignore, is not so much not only to ignore the corpses created by them, but also to ignore corpses that are created by neither side, but which are irrelevant to your ideological.
That's totally untrue.
Well, let me give you an example. One of your own causes that you take very seriously is the cause of the Palestinians, and a Palestinian corpse weighs very heavily on your conscience, and yet a Kurdish corpse does not.
That's not true at all. I've been involved in Kurdish support groups for years. That's absolutely true. It's absolutely false. I just ask the Kurdish, ask the people who are involved in, they come to me, I sign their petitions and so on and so forth. In fact, if you look at the things we've written, let's take a look. I'm not Amnesty International. I can't do everything. I'm a single person. But if you read, say, take a look, say, at the book that Edward Herman and I wrote on this topic. We wrote a book about this in 1979. In it, we discuss three kinds of atrocities, not two, three kinds of bloodbaths. What we called benign bloodbaths, which nobody cares about, constructive bloodbaths, which are the ones we like, and nefarious bloodbaths, which are the ones that the bad guys do. Constructive bloodbaths are things like the Indonesian massacres, which we supported. Nefarious bloodbaths are like Pol Pot. But we also discussed ones that nobody cares about, like Burundi. For example, we have probably the only discussion in the literature, I guess, of the massacres that were going on in Burundi at that time. We probably have the only discussion in the literature, at least that I know of the massacres that are going on in Burma. Now, in fact, not only is what you say not true, but it's the opposite of the truth. We went out of our way to find the kinds of bloodbaths that are just ignored because nobody cares about them. Now, again, let me stress, I'm not Amnesty International. I do not have I don't have the ludicrous egotism which makes me the arbiter of all atrocities over the world, right? I'm not trying to give an A to this country and a B- to this country and so on. The principle that I think we ought to follow is not the one that you stated. It's the principle that we rightly expect Soviet dissidents to follow. Okay, what principle do we expect Sakharov to follow, let's say? What lets us decide whether Sakharov's a moral person? I think he is. Sakharov does not treat every corpse it does not treat every atrocity as identical. He has nothing to say about American atrocities. And when he's asked, he says, I don't know anything about them, I don't care about them. What he talks about is Soviet atrocities, and that's right, because those are the ones that he's responsible for. Just as in, it's a very simple ethical point. You're responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the predictable consequences of somebody else's actions. Now, we understand this when we're talking about dissidents in the Soviet Union, okay? But we refuse to understand it when we're talking about ourselves for very good reasons. Commissars in the Soviet Union don't understand it about dissidents. Commissars in the Soviet Union attack Sakharov and other dissidents because they don't talk about American crimes, right? We understand exactly why that's just hypocrisy and cynicism when they do it. And we should understand the same when we do it. Now, the fact of the matter is that I spend a fair amount of effort on crimes of official enemies. There are a fair number of people in the United States and Canada from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe who are there because of my personal activities on their behalf. But I don't take any pride in that particularly. I just do it because I'm interested in it. The most important thing for me and for you is to think about the consequences of your actions. What can you affect? Those are the ones you primarily ought to be concerned about. Of course, every corpse is a corpse, but there's some that you can affect, and there are others you can't do much about. You know, like I can be worried about things that happened in the 18th century, but I can't do much about them.
This is Peter Worthington, editor of the Ottawa Sun.
It strikes me that your living refutation of the thesis that you can't get a certain point of view across. You've hardly been a shrinking violet over the past 30 years, but it seems to me the effect of your theme has been virtually zilch, except for a few of the elite who support it. It seems to me the great mass of the American people, the workers, either don't understand it or reject it totally.
First of all, I don't agree with your factual assumption. I think it's exactly the opposite of the truth.
What factor?
Well, what you said is that you said correctly that I haven't been a shrinking violet, and you said the effect has been zilch except for elements of the elite. The facts are exactly the opposite. The effects on the elite are zero, and the effects on the general population are not insignificant. Not just me, I'm one person. There are a lot of people doing this sort of thing, and we have much greater outreach than we've ever had before, not through the elite media. I mean, when as I said before, I travel around the country all the time. I can't accept a fraction of the invitations that come. I'm booked up solidly 2 years in advance, and I probably don't accept maybe 10% of the invitations that come in.
This works well for you.
But see, there's a reason for that. That was not true 20 years ago. When I got started in this, I was talking to people. If I could talk to 3 neighbors in a living room, I'd consider it a good evening. You know, I was giving talks on the Boston Common where we had to be protected by the police to prevent us from being murdered. And that was going on until 1966, you know. Boston is a liberal city, incidentally, and this was with the support of the media.
But the media wasn't ignoring you.
Oh, totally, totally. I mean,
how
look,
come all of the
in the 1960s, well, let me see, there are a lot of illusions about this. In the 1960s, the media were completely closed to anybody like me. That includes public radio, for example. The most liberal segment of the American media is probably National Public Radio in Boston, where I live, and I'm not unknown. During the entire Vietnam War, when I was very well known for opposition to the war, I was on National Public Radio once for, I think, 5 minutes, if I remember, after I came back from Vietnam with an extremely hostile interview by the most liberal commentator, Louis M. Lyons. That was it. Now, I could never be in the newspapers or anything of that sort. By the early 70s, it began to change a little. And by the late 70s, it changed more, and in the 1980s, it's considerably more. I mean, it's still very limited, but if I wanted to, I could probably at this point, say, write op-eds for quality local press, not the New York Times, but say the Minneapolis Star-Tribune or something. That was unimaginable in the 60s.
Yeah, but that's the elite, surely.
It's not, no, you see, but that's a reflection of, see, I think that's missing the point. The elites are about as closed as they always were. But the general population has changed, and that's beginning to affect the institutions. I mean, outreach to the general population is much easier than before. No, I mean, I gave my own experience, but other people do the same, have the same experience. You talk to much wider groups, much bigger audiences. They're much more sophisticated. I mean, in the peak of the peace movement, I was always cutting corners. I would never say what I thought. I never talked about the U.S. attack against South Vietnam in the 1960s, even in student activist groups, because they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. Nowadays, I never talked about institutions. I never criticized. Today I talked a little about capitalist democracy. I never talk about that kind of thing. In the 60s, it was just too exotic, But I don't cut any corners anymore anywhere. I can be giving a talk in eastern Kentucky or, central Iowa or something else, and I say exactly what I think, and people generally understand it. They may not agree, they may be surprised, but they want to listen and they want to think about it. Those are changes outside of the elite circles.
Noam Chomsky. I'm Mr. Sinclair.